Institute New Voices Fellow. She is also the Deputy Chairperson of the SOS Coalition. She has also been published by a wide range of South African and international media. Our facilitator tonight is Siki Mgabedeli. She is an award-winning financial journalist. She has worked for various broadcasters in South Africa as a reporter, a producer, an anchor, and editor. I think everybody has heard Siki on some medium at some point. And she has a well-rounded grasp of business and politics. We would like to thank the Hans Seidel Foundation. They are supporting our event tonight. And to thank all the panelists for being with us tonight. Just some things. There is a register going around. My colleague Sylvia has it. Please could you pass it around and sign it? It's pretty important that that gets done. And the hashtag tonight for those on Twitter is Mandela Lecture. So, thank you, and hand over to Siki.
Wherever you are. So I'm going to... Good evening, everyone. I'm going to start with an apology. My voice, and I'm going to be coughing throughout the night. It's that change of season, so I'm always a sucker for the flu at this time of the year. So let me apologize in advance, and I hope you'll forgive me for those moments. But it's exciting to have this conversation. I've been wanting really to kind of get to grips with the lecture as we heard it. And I'm actually quite glad that it's happening after quite a bit of time, that I think we've all had time to mull over it. I don't know about you, but I've had raging arguments and agreements and disagreements over some of the themes that came out, particularly the concept of inclusive capitalism, because business and the economy are things that I spend a lot of time thinking about. So I'm quite curious, particularly in this room, how many of you had heard the term, first of all, inclusive capitalism before that evening? There's just a show of hands. All right. How many of you thought it was a compelling argument? Compelling, that's the way he put it. Was it compelling? Our hands up. Could it be something that we could look at? All right. It's interesting. I want you to pay attention to that, particularly. All right, thank you so much for being here and for participating in this conversation. Sil, I'm going to start with you, and I think let's maybe contextualize the way that President Obama was briefed and how he framed his conversation, and then the reaction to it. What did you as the foundation make of that? You've got a microphone.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think for us, as the foundation, we maybe before I start, with your permission, I think, Khalil, please note that I sent a WhatsApp to our CFO that your bonus needs to be guaranteed. After those comments, I just said minus 50, 50% of whatever, for embarrassing me like that. So, but thank you very much. I think for us, the idea was, maybe I should take a step back and say there's a committee that sits, which includes us as a management team and the board, which looks around who can be the speaker for next year. What's the theme they should address? And what would we ideally want to take out of it? And the committee then would have a selection process, and it's very rigorous, that process, and usually about 9 months ahead, we already know the speaker, so that we can then start the planning process. And so when we thought of President Obama, I thought we need to find someone who, again, it shouldn't be someone that we agree with, shouldn't be someone that we necessarily like, so celebrity doesn't come in. It shouldn't be someone that we would agree with everything they say, and it's more about the theme. And President Obama's name then came up as a retired president, someone that actually broke the mold in terms of how poverty, inequality, everything in society was stacked up against him, not being the president. And if you we were to look at Madiba's life, and that's exactly how that was one thing. And then in terms of the brief, we then asked him to look at how we can have a participatory citizens who are active citizenry, look at democracy that works for the majority, particularly people who are on the margins of society, and how we can break the back of poverty and inequality. So we looked at those three, and we asked him if he can please then respond to that challenge. We believe that he rose to the challenge. His speech was, it had parts which were, you could say, well, that's obvious, we know, but the way one delivers in the context that you deliver also helps. And I think this being the centenary of Madiba's birth, it also helps to then think, what is it that we wanted to achieve? And every lecture is connected to the previous one or the other ones. That's why we had Thomas Piketty, which Khalil reflected on, because each one of them reflects back to the others that we've had before.
All right. Pamela, he took us back to the past, and he drew some parallels to some of the major events globally that have taken place. And he said, let me tell you how we got here, where we are, and then drew a vision for how he thinks we potentially can go forward. Do you agree with the assumptions that he's made about how we got here on economically and politically, and particularly the global economic order that we're sitting with right now?
I think that we can't deny that globalization or internationalization has changed the context within which policies as well as economies are able to develop. So that much I agree with. And we can think of it in particularly in the context of South Africa. So if you think of what happened in the early 90s as we were coming into democracy, this was a time when we had the Washington Consensus, and you had all this narrative around what you really need to do to develop is to tap into global value chains. And the literature, or maybe the criticisms of that approach, were not as extensive at the time. And what we know 25 years later is that it's had different outcomes in different areas, and this has been subject to the way that policies have responded to that opportunity. But in terms of what he's proposed or how he defined inclusive capitalism, I would say that how different is that from what South Africa has on paper? So if you think about it's a market-based system. We already have a market-based system in South Africa where education for every child is available. And on paper, we say that that is what we are going towards, where we protect collective bargaining. And on paper, we say all these things. Even with regards to breaking down monopolies and supporting competition, we have a competition law that says it does this very thing. For me, what I read when I looked at his definition was, if we say as a country we are doing all these things, then why are the outcomes not speaking to this? And that's when you have to look at the detail, because always the devil is in the detail. And the big issue here, I think, and something that maybe has not been properly considered in policy formation over time, is the power dynamics. Right.
And that's what I want to get to, because one of the things that he did was to call out the powerful elites, both political and the economic elites, and almost shame them to a certain extent, including himself. He said when he looks at his bank account, he can't believe how much money he's got in there. So is that not maybe the next step, to shame the elites who think that they can sit on so much wealth all by themselves and maybe give out the crumbs from their tables?
I don't know that shaming the elites is going to bring about the change that we want to see. So for instance, particularly in a market-based system, right, someone is setting the rules of the game. And of course the elites or powerful groups within an economy can influence what those rules look like. But there is a government that is deciding what those policies are. And there are different groups in society, and of course they have different levels of power. But so what are labor unions doing? You know, what are the civil societies doing? So, I mean, I think a good example for me, because it's something that's quite current, is we are redrafting our competition laws. how are we ensuring that the drafting of that act is going to speak more to what we need and where we need to go to as a country? And now that Parliament making comments, making comments on this, and when you look around, who are the people that are in the room? Big business was very much represented, making sure that how these rules are going to shape the space that they're going to be working in is not going to be too detrimental to them. So what were the other organizations that were pushing the agenda of the great majority, ensuring that actually the competition policies that we have speak to the challenges that we have as a country, and also enable the authorities to effectively constrain market power, which is a very big source of economic power. Because a lot of times we tend to think of market power as being separate from economic power. But once you have market power, you have the power to lobby the rules of the game, and you can set the rules such that they benefit you, such that the entrepreneurs that we are wanting to support and we want them to bring about change and create employment don't have that space to be able to do that.
And I do want to explore that, because I think competition law is only as good as the base structure and design of the economy itself, and we still haven't quite dealt with that. But let me bring other people into the conversation. Okay, so let me ask you, I think you're also quite critical of the concept of, inclusive capitalism.
I completely am. We've seen, just as an example, we have seen the rise of big companies that are providing private education on the continent. And in South Africa, for example, what they have managed to do is, in an affluent area, you make the more expensive school, the quality is better. In a bit of a more less, the very same company provides a bit less. And in a very poor community, the school fees are so little, but the quality keeps deteriorating. So what we've developed is, we not only have the segregated private and public system, but even within the private system, we have segregation that's going on there. And too often, that's what being inclusive means, segregating and giving those with less something of a lower quality. We have seen it in different forms of price discrimination as well. Just as an example, when it comes to the cost of data in this country, there's been a lot of complaints about, the cost is too high. What many people don't engage with is the fact that the poor pay so much more for data, right? So if you use a small bundle, you are much more likely to fall into out-of-bundle rates. By the time on Vodacom that you've used a gig of data, you've spent 990 Rand. Compare that with a more affluent person who perhaps has a contract phone and gets bundles that would cost them like less than 100 Rand for a gigabyte of data. Compare that to somebody who can afford the monthly bundle, right? Who would pay 149. And too often, inclusivity in the way it's used in the capitalistic sense means finding ways to make the poor a market, to exploit the poor, or to provide something of a lesser quality to the poor. Yeah.
So what's the alternative?
So the alternative, I would imagine, is fundamentally, if something is about people, if something is rooted in these are what people's needs are, there should be no segregation. You wouldn't need to have capitalism and an inclusive capitalism, right? You would have a system that is fundamentally about people. And just as one example, I love cities. And one of the signs I consider a marker of a good city is the availability of public benches. Consider the way we are. For a homeless person, a public bench can be a place to sleep at night. For a mother who's walking with kids on the way to the taxi rank, who gets tired, whose children get tired, they can sit down and, get a break. For the elderly person, it also means when their knees ache, they can sit down and get a break. What we don't understand is when we talk about rooting things in people and what people's needs are, when those who are most oppressed or have particular needs benefit, society as a whole benefits. Because the homeless person can sleep on the bench, the mother can sit as well. The grandmother can rest, has a place to rest as well. And so the alternative is a system that fundamentally is about meeting people's needs for a decent and dignified life, no matter where you're born, no matter what space in history you find yourself, you are a human being.
And we're going to talk a little bit about how you get there, who's responsible for putting those building blocks together. Particularly, we live in a particular reality right now, right? So does it require a full dismantling of art? Does it require just a few tweaks and all of that? But we'll talk about that in a moment. Civic, inclusive capitalism.
It's a very sneaky term, and it shows the political brilliance of Obama, but I'm not sure it's particularly compelling. And the reason is you put the cart before the horse when you say inclusive capitalism, because the very question is whether capitalism itself is inherently non-inclusive. And so when you give it a veneer of credibility by putting the term inclusive before it, that's like saying I believe in compassionate burglary. So Obama very cleverly causes us to avoid the real debate, which is capitalism inherently non-inclusive? And is it a fool's errand to try to stop the excesses of the capitalist market?
Yeah.
Is this a problem of implementation? Are we just not doing capitalism right? Or is it impossible to do capitalism right? That's the question Obama elided when he invoked this term inclusive capitalism. And I'm afraid I don't think the answer is particularly simple, because it's not altogether clear what capitalism is in the first instance. It's often invoked as this myth, but when you ask someone, so what's capitalism? You get these very vague answers. For me, at least, there are three different things happening. One is the question of markets. Should you have market freedom, or should you have market constraint? But it's actually quite possible to have a socialist market system. So the other question is ownership. Who owns what? And perhaps the foundation of alternatives to capitalism is this idea that those who do the work should own the product, whereas capitalism has this rather different, more distant ownership model where you can not necessarily be the direct worker and still be the beneficiary of the product. So those two things happening. Remember, you could have a market system where workers owned production, or you could have a non-market system and capitalist ownership. So there are already a lot of things going on there. And then the third thing, I think, in addition to the market system and in addition to production, is this whole question of how fair is a society? And is that fairness represented in the way that the capitalist market functions? And Obama's remedy seems to be two things in his speech. Number one, we just tax people, and that redistribution makes the system more fair. And number two is we appeal to the good graces of the very rich to just be more humane. And it's not clear to me that those two things would work. Number one, even if you have a really stringent system of taxation, if the pre-distribution of your society always puts power in the hands of a certain minority, then even if you do tax them eventually, the starting conditions of the society always remain unequal. And we need look no further than our own country to understand how pernicious that can be. As you can see, I have a lot more to say on this, but...
And we will. I want to go back to your initial point about the inclusion of inclusive ahead of the word capital.
Sure.
So, is capitalism malleable, then, would you say? So, we see it, sorry, I think it was on. Is capitalism malleable, then? So, you can apply it in the United States, you can apply it in China. Just depends on how you maneuver certain things. So how malleable is capitalism then?
I think it is appropriate to speak of capitalisms And the irony of capitalism is often the people who invoke capitalism as this great system of transformation use examples where it's not exactly clear that capitalism has been let free. I do think that there are different modes of capitalist production and capitalism, but there do always seem to be these fundamental tenets, this relative market freedom, this private ownership system, and this society as a result that becomes extremely unequal. And it's not clear to me where that has actually been adequately dealt with. We have, for example, Scandinavian economies where there's been great redistribution, but on the basis of an already equal society in many cases. Then we have cases where the market has been severely restricted, but the catch is that you have to have an authoritarian government that has the power and the political will and is not afraid of an election to do that. And so it does seem to me that where capitalism has thrived and succeeded, those conditions don't seem to be similar to the condition at least we find ourselves in South Africa. Now, I think it is also intellectually honest to say that it's not clear what the alternative, at least for me, would be. Because I do think in the short term, it's extremely difficult for us to upend this entire system. Lovely as that may be in theory, in practice, I have severe doubts about what may happen. So the question is, how far can we go in constraining the market? How far should we go? How far can we go in constraining private ownership? And how far should the state encroach into market relationships? My personal view is that we're not going far enough. And I think we should adopt a much more experimental approach. As opposed to tying ourselves to ideologies, I think what we should be doing is saying, we've tried this experiment in, let me speak about the South African context. Yeah. We've tried this experiment. It's been a catastrophic failure for the most part. Even those who extol the virtues of capitalism never use South Africa as an example. Surely we should experiment with something else. Surely we should test how far we can push the market. And look, if it doesn't work and it turns into a socialist dystopia, fine, you were right. But I think we should at least be more willing to try new things and not simply falling back into these different dogmas.
So I feel like we are a country that tries things all the time. In my short span of time on this earth, I'm very young.
Remember the social media, we've seen your age.
I mean, just in the past 24 years, we've had the RDP, we had GEAR, we had ASGISA, we had GIPSA, then we had the NMAL, the National Development Plan that we all told must be implemented. It still exists, but you hardly hear anyone talk about it. Are we too quick to come up with plans, or are we too quick to abandon them? What's your sense?
I think it's a combination of both. In some cases, we have answers to questions we haven't asked yet. So you have people who walk into government, and the first thing is, how do we govern? And you then have the majority who are outside. So let's try bring them in as quickly as possible. So you try introduce RDP. Halfway through, this doesn't work. But we're not sure if we should have tried it in the first place. Maybe we should give it a much longer time for it to keep going. No, but the global economy, and I like how you put it, that globalization then says to us, no, actually that's not the way to go. It might be too socialist in its nature. Maybe we should try something else that can make our funders also happy. So we then move to the next thing. But have we tried it long enough to know that it doesn't work? And sometimes we don't have the staying power. And I don't think we have the patience either. Because with 24 years, if you think of how many community unrest we've had, just on that question of inclusivity, put us in, please. Yeah. And only a few then benefit, and the more they flesh it, the more the communities then feel alienated. So I don't think there's patience, but also because of the long period of oppression, I don't think we also have the time to be patient.
And I want to kind of get to that, about the kind of society we are. Because some might argue that the reason we are always looking for quick solutions and quick ways to get things done is because we actually aren't a cohesive unit. There are too many differing and opposite interests all trying to get to the same pie. So there isn't a common South African goal, if I could say that. I think President Thabo Mbeki called it the two nations at one point. So we sit with that. If we were a common purpose nation, we might actually buy into any plan that comes from the political class.
Is it possible that it's also because of the kind of leadership that we've had? Because sometimes when you have a vision that's clear or a little clearer, people follow or try to follow as much as possible. So if you come to think of Madiba's term, 5 years that it was, he tried to look at nation building, and of course there's a lot of things that could have been done differently. You look at the this year marking the 20th anniversary of the handover of the Truth Commission. It's still unfinished business. We still have to go back there and do some of the things that were recommended there. But at least there was foundation that was proper. We then built into the Mbeki government, and I think after that government, that vision fell away completely. And maybe, I think it's also true that we are a very euphoric nation. We have these moments where everything is perfect. We are a nation of extremes. So President Ramaphosa now, he's like the guy. You know, he's the future. But I promise you that in the next 2 months, like we gave him a year, he hasn't delivered yet. You know, so it's this thing of impatience, mainly because our problems are too deep. Our levels of alienation, the young people who are alienated, the levels of unemployment, just make it impossible to wait.
I mean, we hardly see the headline on the Korea anymore. It's gone. It's starting to quieten down. I want to talk a little bit about where we are at the moment, and just picking up on what Sello and I were talking about, the interplay between politics and economy. Who drives what in the South African? Okay, yeah, because this one. Maybe just keep pressing.
Okay, I think it goes to the point that I was trying to make initially, which is around understanding the interests, understanding the power that different groups in the society hold, and how they are actually able to influence how we do things. So if you, I think Marcelo made reference to how we moved from RDP, was it you, to GEAR and to ASCISA. So a lot of people have actually written about how that happened. And the GEAR document that we all know was almost copy and paste of the document which was titled A Growth for All, which was done by the top 50 of the JSE, right? So we were assuming that if we do all these things around liberalizing financial markets, about trade liberalization, about the approach that we take to inflation targeting, etc., then we assume that big business will do their part, which is to invest in the economy, and that's going to drive jobs, right? So there were no conditionalities or clear, if we put this, as policymakers on the table, then you have to put this as business, and if you don't, this is what we're going to do to take the rents back. So, and the other thing is that what sometimes you don't hear discussed is the tie between economic structure and inequality, right? So the economy that we have is biased towards capital-intensive industries linked primarily to the minerals and resources industries. So these are industries that aren't going to hire that many people, right? But these are also industries that are producing intermediate goods that would be consumed by the downstream industries that tend to be more labor absorbing. And you have issues that the competition authorities and other regulators deal with all the time, which is the pricing then that goes from the upstream to the downstream. So we're in an economy where these companies that hold the core of the economic structure have power to influence, because it can be, well, if this doesn't happen, then the plant has to shut down and the few jobs that we have are going to go away. Then it sometimes feels like we are taking a reactionary approach to it. And I mean, just to make it clear, because I don't know if people are as familiar with the issues that I'm raising. So a few years ago, we had Mittal going to the government and asking for import tariffs for protection for steel, right? But if you understand the history of Mittal in this economy and how they've been able to extract rands from the economy, it becomes quite disturbing. So ISCO, which then became Mittal, was a state-owned company. And then in the euphoria for globalization, privatization was also the talk of the town. So we privatized a number of our industries, including the steel industry. And so what happened here, that was an unbundling of a conglomerate where Kumba, which produces the iron ore, was separated from Mittal, who does the basic steel production. And what we did is that Mittal said, no, if there is to be that separation, then there has to be commitment that Kumba would price on a developmental basis. And this was put in the contract, that they had to price on a cost-plus basis. But the agreement between Mittal pricing to the downstream industry was simply verbal. It was not put down on paper. And Mittal never priced on a developmental basis. And as a result, if you track what happened in terms of the competitiveness and employment of our downstream industries, they suffered, right? And Mittal has had 2 excessive pricing cases against them. They have been involved in about 5 cartels, which talk about the kind of conduct and how they've been able to leverage that power to extract profits from the economy. And this is not unique.
Musical chairs with the microphones.
And this is not unique to just the steel industries. There have been many studies, including studies by the World Bank and the IMF, that show that profits in South Africa are very high, yet investment is very low. And then when problems came with the recession and other issues that occurred in the steel industry, there were some global issues as well, then Mittal runs again to government and says, we need to be protected from the international competition, right? And this, we were talking about very important jobs, but 20,000 jobs. But the jobs in the downstream industries that are affected by what happens at the upstream industries is 150,000. Yeah. So what should we be prioritizing? What happens at the upstream or what happens at the downstream? And yes, there are conditionalities that have now been placed on Mittal through this process. So they had to settle the competition cases, but this was 1 billion rand. Only 1.5 billion rand. But if you think about 5 cartels, 2 excessive pricing cases over 25 years, all settled for 1.5 billion rand. And even some of the pricing conditions that have been placed through the competition settlement are actually not strong enough and won't come into effect in reality. Yeah. So it's about how do we set the rules and how do we ensure and enforce that when we are allowing rents to be taken, which are required in many instances, and countries develop using industrial policy and you create rents, but making sure that there will be greater benefit.
But this again goes back to what I was saying about the structural nature of our economy. This is just one example, but we know that in the early 90s, in that time, many companies that had been state-owned were broken up, taken, given to certain individuals at a particular time who continue 24 years later to expect some level of support from the state. So I want us to go back to what do we need to do about the structure of our economy, how the relationship between state and business, the relationship, as you mentioned, particularly the role that the Department of Trade and Industry plays, our Competition Commission plays, and so on. Because it cannot be right that even as we have suffered all of those job losses over time, many companies taking their primary listing, their headquarters out of the country, fully allowed, that came back to not only bite them as businesses, but to bite our economy as well. Do we not have to maybe go back to that conversation around an economic CODESA?
I think if we are to start right now, what I would say we need to do is a number of things. So, for instance, we need to consider the design of our macroeconomic policy, and is it in line with our economic goals as a country? So, if you think of our approach to inflation targeting, for instance, or to curbing inflation, is by raising interest rates, right? But what effect does that have on the rest of the economy? So if you say we're trying to build an entrepreneurial and small businesses, those are interest rates that they need to pay back. In terms of the developmental funding that we are providing to companies, at what rates is that being provided, and how patient is it? And is it consistent with the context of the economy? I was at a session last week where a farmer was telling a story about how from a development, a DFI, they were getting prime plus 5%. This is someone who's farming avocados, who it's going to take 5 years because he's going to, before they get any fruits from those trees. If you are already paying interest for 5 years into it, are you really going to be a significant player in the market? So it's about rethinking, and what some of the research at CRED shows is that we should have a broader competition policy. So this is not just about competition law, but a policy that says that finance, not just developmental finance, but also how we can influence financing by banking, which is actually biased towards financing your houses and your cars rather than financing businesses. How to create finance for rivalry and for risk. And you have to accept that, sometimes, you're going to invest in 4 companies and 3 are not going to do well. But if the 1 or the 2 that do well is able to grow and change our production structure, that is something that is significant. The amendments to the competition law are also quite an important aspect of that. The biggest criticism, at least from our part of the competition law, has been how it doesn't go far enough to deal with abuse of dominance. And this is the structure and the design of the law and what is required to prove that a firm has actually abused its dominance. So I'd like to see that go into the changes that now the minister or parliament is considering. It's also about designing industrial policy that is more supportive. I think for a long time we didn't have an overarching industrial policy in this country until 2007, and that's crazy when you think about where we're coming from as a country. And that came in the form of the National Industrial Policy Framework. But if you really critically engage with IPAP, which is the document that gives effect to the NIPF, it's really a document that governs the DTI. That is not how you do industrial policy, and that is not how you develop economies. You need a lot of coordination. The Department of Science and Technology has a big role to play. The Department of Energy has a big role to play. I think discussions now about how ESCOM is going to allocate this excess capacity that it have are very much important for understanding the kind of market that you're trying to create. Previously, those discounts or subsidized rates for ESCOM were provided to capital-intensive industries. So now if we're saying we want diversification and the industries that will bring about employment, we should be subsidizing those types of industries. So your metal castings, your foundries, your machinery equipment, your plastics firms.
We already have the framework for that because we've done it before, right? I want to talk about Koketso and Sizwe, inequality and democracy. Sizwe, you feel that there's a massive impact that inequality has on democracy. Tell us about that.
Yes, and this is one of the things that we aren't told about capitalism. What we're often reminded is that the bottom has risen under capitalism. And if you look globally, which is not always a good picture, that is true in many cases. The problem is that as the bottom has risen, so the top has also accelerated, and the concentration has become even more grotesque in many cases. And so you've solved one problem by replacing it with another problem that has tremendous impacts for questions of democracy and questions of the proximity of financial power to political power. And we need look no further than the 2 countries represented at the Obama lecture to see that. We had 2 billionaires on the stage, one of which was a president. And of course, the president of the United States is also a billionaire. So you've got to give it to us for efficiency. We don't mind the proximity of money to power. We just make the president and the billionaire the same person. And what does that do? Well, it completely makes, it causes a disproportionate amount of power to reside in a grotesque minority, which is then able to control the direction that a society goes in. And that has frustrated South Africa's progress and America's progress in many ways, perhaps predominant among which is the question of race. So when you have these massive concentrations of power, what we've seen is current modes of capitalism have been brilliant at causing this production and causing this inequality, but absolutely terrible at reversing it. So when you code capitalism to be racialized, and then you sit back and you say, wait, hold on, let's let the market do the work and we'll all go to some utopia, what you actually find is that it just gets re-racialized. The market pathways have been coded such that opportunity is racially determined in South Africa and the United States. And so I think the next layer of this debate is what happens when inequality means that you can buy political influence to the extent that democracy becomes a sham. And ordinary citizens, people, participate in pantomimes every 5 years, but the real decisions are taken behind closed doors by billionaire presidents.
Are we not there? Or close to it?
I think we very much are. And to return to an earlier theme, I don't think we are very good at trying things. I think we're very good at repackaging things. The new dawn is the repackaged old dawn. Literally, it's the same thing with a different package around it. And even that package was there before. GIA, ASGISA, the new growth path, the NDP. I'm not sure what's particularly different. I mean, sure, we've tinkered at the margins, but it doesn't seem to me that we've been as ambitious as we should have been. And so, if we are, I mean, either we're doomed, and we should all go home this evening, or we do have to launch a more ambitious attempt at redistributing power in our country. And that's not going to be an easy journey, but it's one that I think we have to understand. Unless we embark on, we're going to get the same results as we've been getting.
And so one of the points that President Obama made was that, you know, while globalization and technology, for example, and he talked a little bit about the fourth industrial revolution, AI, and all of that, and how wonderful all of that is. And he says it's opened up new opportunities, but what it's also done is that it's created a new kind of inequality. It's created a new kind of, I've forgotten the word, and I should have written it down, but it's a level of inequality between those countries that are already there and those of us who are not even trying to catch up, but just trying to get the tools to be able to, at some point, catch up. I wonder how, if we're ignoring what technology might do in this whole conversation about economic inequality between countries.
So I think that technology is often exceptionalized, right? Throughout history, there have always been technological advancements. And even right now, the idea that we are so well networked is so exceptionalized. We've been networked for a while. When the fax machine came into being, you actually needed other people to have fax machines to be able to connect to them. So the network effect has been something that has always been consistently there. What becomes the problem, though, is when you talk about technology as if technology is neutral, as if existing power lines and existing inequality will magically change when you put technology in, as if technology is not going to reinforce, if not make worse, some of those inequalities, right? And I think that is the danger with this exceptionalization, with this fascination, and with this putting it as a completely neutral thing. And then secondly is also just even the idea, you know, there's been a massive concern about what does it mean, AI, mechanization, what are they going to do to jobs, right? It is a very, very legitimate concern. But conversely, something that hasn't been explored very much, health services in this country have depended a lot on community health workers. Care is not something that you can easily mechanize. What does this mean about the potential opportunity of care and the role of the care economy, the care industry, actually being valued as it should have been in the first place? Do you know? So I think too often, yeah, there's this concern about, oh, what does it mean in this side? Because we only see jobs or meaningful jobs as one thing, and we don't see the moment, the potential of, well, this potentially means that there are these industries that have made a fundamental, that continue to have a fundamental impact on where we are as a society, that cannot be mechanized or not as easily mechanized. But we must not romanticize it at all. I mean, right now, there's been a big discussion about the regulations, right? We haven't been able to regulate in many ways traditional companies. And right now, we are looking at the on-demand economy, right? That is, so when I talk about the on-demand economy, I'm talking about your Ubers, your, you know, the FANGs. FANG is Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, right? People who come into countries who do not pay tax here, but benefit so much from what is public investment in infrastructure, right? People who can come in and it is not demanded of them that you contribute back into the society from which you profit. You also do not decimate the production sector of that country by having a certain percentage of what you broadcast coming from the country, right? And these are some of the things we're not considering.
We haven't even figured out how to get our money through from illicit financial flows back from physical
And here we are.
domiciled companies. All right, I'm going to take a pause now for a moment and see if there are any questions from some of the themes that we've explored. Comments, questions from the floor. There's one here. There's a microphone coming. Hopefully it works.
Two quick comments. Sorry. Thank you. The only attempt to create an inclusive capitalism was in Europe after the Second World War, and it was called social democracy. And that depended on very strong trade unions, on civil society to take on the power of the corporate sector, where the state as well mediated because the labor movement was strong enough to influence the state. Now, you haven't addressed that. But in South Africa, the ANC in the early 90s turned its back on the RDP, which had strong elements of social democracy, and instead, under pressure from the World Bank, the IMF, United States, the EU, abandoned that very mild form of redistribution and people's power and actually adopted the most grotesque version of capitalism, which we call neoliberal capitalism, which is privatization, casualization, the emasculation of any kind of popular mass working class, working class, input and influence on society. So we've had a debacle of the highest degree. When we say we've had an enormous efflux of capital from this country, untold billions, we've created a climate of corruption at the top with billionaire presidents, whose billions came from political connections. So we don't have a political elite which is economically productive. What I'm saying is not new. It is mentioned every day in the media from every possible perspective. And unfortunately, the Competition Board has proven to be one of the most toothless watchdogs imaginable. So the big bosses get away with it over and over again. So I'm surprised that none of you have spoken about the political revolution that we need in order to give muscle back to working class formations that can really get to the roots of this debacle. Maybe you should comment on that.
We shall
Thank
do
you.
so. Let's take me. Oh, there's another one over there. This side. Hello, that side. Have you? Oh, don't worry, she's got one.
Thank you. Good evening. I just wanted to add a little bit of positivity, because if you do some hunting around and if you do some Googling is occasionally our friend, you find that there are some pretty good case studies in terms of the fact that this is not a new dilemma and it's been going for a long time. So I can bring you a 100-year case study, effectively, that was set up by a young guy aged 24 in the UK more than 100 years ago. They're now an 90,000 person business, 11 billion pounds turnover, no external shareholders. So what came up 100 years ago was a situation where there was a huge disparity between the haves and the have-nots. So John Spedden Lewis took this situation and set up a social experiment in social class reconciliation. And what he wanted to do was bring a social conscience to capitalism, because he recognized how perverse it was even 100 years ago. This is John Spedden Lewis in the UK. So it was a social class experiment, if that makes sense. So 100 years later, what we've done is taken their social class reconciliation and fairness model and been running it for the last 10 years in terms of social class, gender and race as well. So within this business model, it is capitalist. However, what it does is it puts constraints on there. It says the top can be no further than a certain ratio above the bottom, which means if you want to raise the top, you're going to have to really pull up the bottom. And they've done very well at it. It's not perfect, but the nice thing about it is that it was fairness and reconciliation based. So what he really wanted to show was that you could take the principles of capitalism and really focus on the ists, which seem to be the major problem, and particularly the captains of industry in terms of how perverse they make it. So, for example, our top 10, bottom 10 ratio is 7, which is on a par with Nordic countries. We're an 80 million rand business. We've tripled the team, tripled the business in 6-7 years. And you can actually do it, but it does require a firm hand, if that makes sense, and actually being able to take it by the collar and knock it into shape.
All right, I'm going to take one more. Is that okay? And then we'll respond. There's one here. Please pass the microphone down. Thank you.
Carrying on from the lady on my left and picking up on themes raised by the panelists, my name's Graham Bailey. The question was posed, we were talking about, and I'm going to truncate what I'm trying to say, because I'm sure lots of people want to contribute. Have we taken the various experiments to redress the worst aspects of capitalism? Have we tried it long enough? You've heard what my colleague here says. And the gentleman on the right about trade unions, well, even further back than that, more than 100 years ago, there was a guy called Robert Owen, Seasway will know, who was involved in the textile industry. He built what was known as the New Lanark Mill in Scotland, which became a pilot scheme for trying to redress the excesses of capitalism. And in fact, people came from all over the world to study Robert Owen's experiments. What was his experiment? He set up a textile mill. He was making a lot of money. He had a social conscience. He started planting, getting the workers to feed themselves and to subsidize the food that they were. He built creches for the women in the textile industries. He built hospitals. We had a comment about the health, paying back into the health, yeah? And for all the people in the audience who like Cadbury's chocolate, and they like dark chocolate, anybody know what the word Bourneville means? Bourneville was the village built by the Cadbury family on the basis of sharing the profits that they made out of their industry. It's recently been taken over after 150 years by, help me Seasway, who's the big Swiss company, Kraft, anyway, they've just been bought out. And after 150 years of building schools, building hospitals, building creches, making sure that the benefits and profits are shared with the workers, giving bursaries to Oxford and Cambridge. So, for over 150 years...
I do need you to wrap up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then, yeah, for 150 years, people have recognized that they need to pay back from the surplus they make. Yeah. Okay? After the First World War, there was a guy called Warburg.
We can't.
Wait, please, this is...
I understand, but I do have time constraints.
Can I
so
just
I
finish what I'm
wrap
saying?
Up. Yes, please.
Warburg introduced the first, I'm going to truncate this, hedge fund. And we now have massive corporations. We talk about inclusive capitalism. They don't even want to pay tax. They want their money to go offshore so they don't pay any tax. That's where we've arrived at after 150 years of non-inclusive capitalism.
All right, but how did we arrive at this point where we've created? Is it a globalization issue? I mean, there's a big discussion, Caesar, right now about countries starting to look inward. There's a lot of internalization. In fact, Donald Trump in the United States is saying, let's make America great again. Let's kick everybody else out. Let's make sure every deal is about America first. And we've seen similar noises in Europe. I think the only people we heard saying maybe globalization is not done yet was China in recent months.
Yeah, I mean, let me start with some of the points raised from the floor. I think the first point about social democracy is something that I gestured towards, and I think post-war Europe is an interesting example. When we think about the South African context, I think the great tragedy is that if we are going to dig ourselves out of this hole, we're going to need a strong and a capable state to do it. And social democratic principles have always required that the state accounts for the excesses of capitalism. And the great tragedy now, I think, is that not only do we have this very unequal market system, but we don't seem to have a state that would be able to intervene in a way that could account for those. So what we have to do is two things at once, which is build a capable state, which isn't actually that hard. I think it could be done, and then introduce, I think, a more social democratic model. I think just to stay on the question of examples, another interesting case is after the Cold War, you have the Asian tigers, and you have Eastern Europe, and even Africa. In Eastern Europe and Africa, what we have is a very radical marketization, decentralization, and the results, the economies simply couldn't cope with the amount of change. Whereas in the Asian example, if you permit just the ignorance of a few autocratic governments, from a policy perspective, what you have is a more experimental approach where market reforms are introduced through different periods of time, and the economy is changed in a more experimental and gradual way. And economically speaking, I think those are interesting ways to look at what we can do. A great transformation is a wonderful idea, but perhaps we need to think about making sure that any gains we make are sustainable and those gains can be built upon, as opposed to dramatic transformations. And so when we come to the question of, I'll just answer the floor's question. Sorry, Sike, and then I'll hand over to you. I think it's laudable and it's important that both these historical and contemporary examples exist. And I think we should be encouraging companies to do what they can. But I think the question still remains fundamentally, when you look at the systemic level, is it reasonable to assume that all companies would do this? And wouldn't other companies cheat? If companies are imposing restrictions on themselves and perhaps limiting what they can do to profit, aren't there other companies lurking in the background waiting for that moment so that they cannot do those things and then keep the profits? And so it does seem to me, unless we intervene quite decisively, we might have pockets of excellence and interesting examples, but the systemic problem would still remain. And that again comes back to this idea of who can account? How do we dislodge power? It's not gonna, we can't appeal to billionaires to just be nicer people for once. That's not gonna work on a long-term basis. We need power to dislodge power, and that power requires the state, I think, as the best example of organized power that can counteract that power. And sadly, we've lost both in the last 25 years in many ways.
So I completely agree, you know, some good examples, but we do not have the time to wait for the benevolence of the rich, right? And we know right now that there are people who are avoiding paying taxes already, you know? So we can just, the benevolence can only go this far. So I do think it has to be very, very deliberate, you know? And even the idea, there was discussion, somebody mentioned economic targets. I always come back to people, right? For a very long time in South Africa, the pie actually did grow. So this idea that people are suffering because the pie is no longer growing, actually the pie was growing for a very long time. But in some industries where the pie grew, what we did see is that in real terms, workers' salaries were decreasing over time. That is scary. So even this assumption that a growing pie or reaching targets means a better life for everybody is very false, and it has been proven to be so throughout, not just in South Africa, right, but in many other places. So I do think it has to be a very deliberate process of saying, at the center of all this are people, you know? This economy, this world, this society should exist in people's best interests, you know? And people's best interests or dignity and decent lives cannot be put at the benevolence of the hands of the few. We are already complaining that so much wealth has given people the ability to influence policy. And right now, some of you may have been following the state capture inquiry that's been going on. But at the heart of it is not one family. At the heart of it is the significant power of private individuals and private capital, the influence they have on decision-making processes of the state. That's it. And that is what we need to be engaging and dislodging. And even at other scales, like at a smaller scale, right? When the sugar tax was going to be passed, I remember there were parliamentarians who were commenting about how industry had threatened them, right? So, you know, it's playing itself out. And so again, the benevolence, waiting for the benevolence of the rich, also still maintains the same power structure. That means those with capital can influence how the rest of society functions.
So would you say that inclusive capital would not dismantle that then? It would just be...
It's a repackaging. It's a repackaging,
okay.
But the sexy word.
All right. Silo?
For me, we need to also look at how for the poor to be able to participate, you have to always buy your way in. In other words, no scheme just comes and says, here is something for you. You have to contribute something. And most of the time, you don't even get in because you have the wrong ticket. And it's that we need to also look at, because for as long as the majority are outside, because they don't have access to the technologies that we make sound like now, and I think Koketo said it better, because when we were saying about the data, how data works, I didn't know that how it costs the poor as opposed to the rich. It's exactly how it happens with electricity. The poor pay more to subsidize the rich. And even in this case, you'd then have the poor still having to pop in something for them to participate. Where do they get that? And I think that's the thing that we need to then be talking about. How do we dismantle the system so that it favors the marginalized?
I'd like to pick up on what Koketso was saying around power. I think this is something that in South Africa we have not engaged significantly with. I mean, there's a brilliant book that I do recommend, which came out in 1996 by Ben Fine and Zavary Rustomji, which is the political economy, South Africa's political economy, from minerals and energy complex to industrialization. It tells you a lot about the Afrikaner system of accumulation and how it is that they built industries and were able to create Afrikaner capital. You know, and given that when they came in, there was English capital which was prevailing. And when we look at how then the South Africa's system of accumulation has changed over time, it hasn't been that significant. So we had, for instance, black economic empowerment, which was supposed to be driving towards building black capital. But even that initiative was captured, to tap into common words, by the elite. So it's done very little to create independent black businesses that can challenge the incumbent firms. What it has done is it has, through the shareholder schemes and the BEE codes, it allows the co-opting of a few into existing structures. We have to be able to deal fundamentally with the structure of our economy. We will not be able to have greater participation with the current structure that we have. So if we're saying we want to drive towards black people, and not just the black middle class, but the greater society being fully able to participate and being able to benefit from the economy, then we really need to look at that. And this idea of understanding the power dynamics, I think, becomes very important, right? Because Sizwe talks about how you need to have a capable state. There's very compelling work around political settlements which says you can have a capable state, but if the power dynamics behind the scenes do not allow that state to be able to take those decisions, then those decisions won't be taken. So, I mean, the gentleman raised the issue around RDP. It was agreed throughout the country that RDP is what we needed. But the power dynamics behind the scenes through the narratives of the Washington Consensus and the kind of ideologies that what you really needed, was to create that openness and capital would come in. If you think about the kind of capital that's come into our country has been short-term, right? It hasn't been productive investment, which is what we need to deliver. So understanding that, and I liked the idea about understanding trade unions, right? So in the example that I gave around Mittal, the relative power between the trade unions supporting the upstream business versus the trade unions supporting the downstream business meant that it appeared that trade unions supported the further protection of Mittal. So how do we build broader coalitions of interests? I mean, so how do we take on the challenge, the plight of not just the poor, but really the long-term growth of our economy? Business is very organized, and they will ensure that their interests are considered at every point in time when big decisions need to be taken. But how are the interests of the majority being presented? I mean, we talk about the poor as people sometimes that are far away, but the ability to organize is very important in terms of ensuring that your interests are factored into decision making. How are the poor able to organize? And I mean, there was reference earlier around in terms of the kind of strikes and public service strikes that we've seen. And statistics show now that there's been a huge increase, I think between in the early period, we had on average around 900 strikes a year, and between 2013 and 2017, that rose to 2,000. And what's important around research that's come around there is that it's not strikes about, I don't have water. It's about exclusion from the democracy.
Yeah. And that's what I want to talk about, because the thing about South Africans and the public, they're not sitting at home moaning. They're out on the streets and they are protesting, right? What happens? Is it that we've become so used to being co-opted into organizations? So whether it is an umbrella federation of a trade union or a political party, and therefore organizing around a particular protest must happen under a specific umbrella for it to be listened to by those in power? What's happened to that people power, the people who are protesting, those over 2,000 protests that we see in our informal settlements, that we see in our townships, that we see in our cities, and yet they don't lead to change in the way that people are treated or in service delivery or any of those things. Where's the disjuncture? Anyone want to pick up on that?
I'm happy to start on the conversation. I think a lot of what happens is that we put band-aids on a lot of issues. So when GEAR came up and the problems with that kind of policy for South Africa started showing up, then we expanded our social protection in terms of, the words just disappeared from my head. Yes, it does. So if you think about the grants, yes, social grant system. Now there's nothing wrong with having a social grant system, but the direction that we're going is unsustainable, and it is it is a symptom of the problem that people aren't able to access employment so that they can make their own income to be able to do these things. So in a way, social grants are a band-aid, right? So it seems that that temporarily the problem is addressed. So we had fees mishaul, which was a big issue, and but only that becomes addressed, right? We're not thinking about the systematic influence that all these decisions are making. So we've been looking at these issues piecemeal. And I think we do need to just start unbundling. And also even I think the middle class, which has a lot of power that it's not tapping into, is complicit in a lot of ways. So we're happy that the decision is to invest on the Gautrain because it makes our lives easier. But what about the people that are waking up at 3 a.m. to be able to make it to work at 7 o'clock? How sustainable is that? The people that are spending 50% of their income on transportation. But we are very happy that there's the Gautrain. I mean, I must say, when the Gautrain wasn't working for 2 weeks, my life was miserable because I drive between Pretoria and Joburg. But it's about us then stepping out of that comfort zones, right, and pushing as well for the economy and the path that we would like to see.
I think for me, the reason that there hasn't been much impact in terms of these strikes is that most of those people don't belong. When you belong to a power base, it's known where you belong in terms of your power base. You're likely to be listened to. When you are just an active citizen who just wants things to change, and I'll give a tangible example. In Klerksdorp, where I was born, you can have protests going on for weeks, because, by the way, another thing is they can't be sustained, because as soon as the looting ends, you've looted so many shops, then the criminal element is the one that fuels it for a while, and then once that falls away, son, what's next? And it's that sense that citizens need to exercise their power differently. Because for as long as come the time when you have to then exercise that power, which is the vote, you vote the same way. They then say, no, these guys who are protesting they are not part of the problem. Actually, the problem is the problem is with these people who keep protesting for nothing, because there's no problem that we have in municipalities particularly. And I think it's about maybe taking us back to where we were in the 70s, 80s around civic movements, which were about ensuring that you have people who belong without having to be in a party. And until such time that that's recognized as a power base, I don't think we're going to go anywhere.
So when the National Planning Commission developed the National Development Plan, there was a video that was made. The video, that stick video, told us the story of Thandi. It told us, because Thandi was born in a certain space in history to a certain family, this is what Thandi's life projection would probably be. Thandi would possibly not access higher education. Thandi might drop out of school. Thandi is likely to fall pregnant. Thandi is likely to continue a life in poverty. Now that is an incomplete story. In South Africa, you cannot tell us the story of Thandi without telling us the story of John Smith. John Smith is not someone who innately has much more capabilities than Thandi. John Smith's life is very different from Tandi's, not because he's any more special, but their lives are so intertwined because of historic, dispossession, and contemporary failures of leadership and different forms of dispossession. Now, the reason I give this story is that very often when we talk about inequality or power, it almost feels like we just talk about it as if it just exists, as if there are no beneficiaries to it, as if nobody is actively working to prop it up and keep it in place. And I think that, for me, is what we need to engage. When we talk about systemic things, we need to be engaging that these systems are not just there. They are created. They are propped up. People actually benefit from it and do not pay the price for that massive injustice. Point number one. Point number two, I would like to respectfully disagree over here. Now, part of the difficulty I have when we talk about protests and looting and the criminal element, right? I remember when the Socioeconomic Rights Institute launched one of its community practice notes, and it was after they had looked at different informal settlements and the protests that had gone on. There was one man who spoke about how he got a call from the SABC who wanted to come cover the protest. And the journalist asked him, "Are you guys burning anything?" And when he said no, and then they said, "We're not interested." That's number one. Number two, there was a report that was released some years ago called The Smoke That Calls. That report is titled that because the man was describing how, government, they attempted to engage with government over time, and government only seems to come in when something is burning, Vuwani being an example. So the reason I give this is just to show how violence is incentivized in many ways, both by government, both by members of society, and in some cases media as well. With all the number of protests that happen in this country, actually, that's not how the majority of them even turn out. But it's become the default assumption to think it is, because those are the only ones that ever make it anyway, which is an incentive, because I only get heard when I am throwing something, when I am burning something, and when I am, And on the other hand, the assumption that people who are facing certain things are the one who are always burning and looting is also false. A good example is in Vuwani. Remember when the people were protesting and all the schools started burning down? And there was the sense, oh, people are protesting, burning their own schools. And what did it turn out? The ANC faction battles was what was causing the schools to burn. It was the factional battles of the ANC. And people get blamed for taking a stance against their circumstances. So I think we should be very, very careful about, just understanding that, the narratives that we sometimes see don't paint a full story in South Africa. Like the story of Thandi and John Smith, South Africa's public discourse has a fascination with half stories. And we need to get to a point where we are telling the full story and how this intertwines with so many other things as well.
Thanks. Yeah, just staying on this question of politics and how that influences economic inequality, I think fundamentally the task that is in front of us is creating an adequate political alternative. I think part of the reason we have failed for so long is because we're holding on to our last hope that the ANC is going to become something that it never will become. And that hope, I think, has set us back decades. And part of the reason for that is of course, the ANC's moral sway, but it's also because of failures in alternatives. I think some are emerging, but none of them have yet, let's not even get started with the DA, but none of them have yet grasped the imagination and given South Africans this idea that actually something different is possible. So I think for as long as we are holding out hope for new dawns, we're not going to see change. Now, it's not all doom and gloom, because I think really interesting things have happened. I mean, if you take the 2016 elections, that was a fundamental shift in our politics. And with 2019 coming up, I'm a bit worried, because I think we were on the cusp of having a more accountable government just by virtue of its ability to lose power, and we've now lapsed back into giving them all the power so that they can do whatever they want, because they told us everything would be different again. And so I think we need to be a little bit more savvy in the way that we vote, and realize that this is not about some long-held and long-cherished affinity with any party. It's about being strategic about what's going to get us the most accountable government at any given time. And that might mean not voting for the ANC in 2019, and then voting for it in another election when there really is a new dawn. And instead of us thinking that we have to nail our colors to the mast at any time. And it also involves the hard work of trying to build a political alternative. Because ultimately, as I mentioned before, if we don't have the state, I'm not sure what we do have, and I do take the point, and I think it's a really important one, that even a capable state may not be sufficient. Yeah. But that's not an argument to have an incapable state.
Yeah. No, certainly.
And so we may need a capable state and other things. And how do we build that? And I think that's really what confronts our generation. And it's something that gives our generation, and I think you're starting to see it, we finally understood what it is that we have to do in the story.
You know, excuse me, as important as elections are, and look, I respect elections. People died and fought for our right to vote, and we must do it, and that's what I believe. What happens in between elections? Because that is at the point at which people feel the most unheard, the most vulnerable, the most needing to make as much noise to be heard. What is it that we, as civilians, as you know, as citizens, can do in between those elections?
Well, I think there is a link between the two, because if a government understands that it can be dislodged from power, not just at elections, but between elections, then I think that changes the dynamic between the citizenry and the government on the one hand. But then, of course, there are other short-term things that need to be done. And I think a lot of it just revolves around being unapologetic. Because AfriForum is unapologetic, but where are the counterweights to AfriForum in our society? AfriForum doesn't run for elections, but they seem to enjoy disproportionate influence and media attention. And we're not going to defeat AfriForum by just sitting back and saying, oh, well, you know, these crazy AfriForum people. We're going to have to build the thing that is the AfriForum of actually doing stuff that we need to do, which we don't have yet, you know. An unapologetically pro-black AfriForum, or an unapologetically pro-women AfriForum, or whatever's needed. We do need to build those institutions, and I think to some extent what we've done is renounce that ability to a hope that the ANC will self-correct, and in doing so we've let our power go, and now we're in the situation where we don't have any power, and the ANC won't self-correct, and so we're in a corner.
All right. I've got time for one more round of questions. I will take 4. So there's 1, 2. I need 2 more hands. Going 1, 3. Great. Well, let's take those 3. We'll start there.
Sure. My name's Dale McKinley. I have 2 comments that sort of parallel as questions. And you'll excuse me, I came in a bit late, so you might have addressed this. But the first one is, if the entire notion of inclusive capitalism presupposes expansivism, in other words, if you only be inclusive of the 2/3 of the world's population that is excluded, then you have to expand the space. What about the ecological limits of which capitalism has come up against? This is fundamentally, for me, the biggest question in the room, which is the entire model of capitalism is based upon an assumption of constant accumulation, constant expansion, constant profit. And it's already coming up against those limits. So it doesn't matter how much we tinker. It doesn't matter how much you cut the pie differently. if the ecological limits are reaching their, if it's another 20, 30, 40 years down the road, and we can see it in our own country very, very clearly, then what are the options there? Because inclusivity is not really an objective reality. The second one is, in the process of this exclusivity, people run to refuges. In other words, they seek increasingly narrow identities. This is what we're seeing around the world. Religious identities, ethnic identities, masculine identities, sexual identities, whatever they are. In other words, instead of being inclusive, we're getting more exclusive. People are retreating into exclusive little zones, whether that's a residential zone and new walled cities that are being for the rich, or whether it's a religious zone and anyone who doesn't believe what you believe, or whatever the case might be. Wars are being fought, conflicts are at their highest ever. So the entire model, once again, presupposes that there is something inherently inclusive about it. What is that?
Good evening. I think one of the things that really bothers me about some of these discussions is that, one, they happen away from communities. The communities that we talk about. I think the reason why there's so many strikes and why the strikes are getting so violent is, if you were to spend a day in someone's life and actually try and access some of the services that are offered and see how badly people are treated on a daily basis, you will understand the anger that comes with some of these strikes. I'm not saying that they must burn, etc. things, but for many years people have been literally taken from what is theirs to absolutely nothing. And I'm glad the lady there, actually started. We can't have this conversation without saying we come from an apartheid state. We cannot, because then we're having a conversation in the sky where there is no base to it. The other issue that I think is also missing from this is that we talk about decisions and things that actually affect people. People are not, part of the issue with why we don't stick to any particular program is because information is not disseminated equally amongst people. The reason why we are here is because we saw the invitation and we confirmed. The people out there don't get the information that they're supposed to get for them to actually live. And that is the wrong that is going on in South Africa. And until that is addressed, we will not get anywhere. We need to start dealing with the issues of why we are here. The ANC is not the answer, I agree. But do you know why people don't move away from voting for the ANC? Who else is there? Who else is there to actually... The reason why ANC has got that loyal vote for all these years is because they got them out of an apartheid state. That's the belief. But what now? And the idea of not voting is almost sacrilege. It's almost like you are creating the biggest sin there is, because we have people who died for us to vote. Now I'm sitting at home and using this as a holiday. Do you understand the deepness of where we are and why we are here? And until we start to, and I think when I listen to Barack Obama, this inclusive capitalism, we have companies who are supposed to give of their salary to the betterment of the communities around them, and we know they don't do that. They use days like Nelson Mandela Day to do the littlest they possibly can. And they publicize it everywhere so that everybody can see they did that. Is that what this process is actually about? Give because you want to give. Not give because you are told, or give because you want publicity. No company is actually doing what they're supposed to be doing in South Africa. And the stupid part about the whole process is that nobody holds them accountable. SIU, the fact that you actually are, as a company, can come from another country and do better in South Africa is another thing that boggles my mind. South Africans are trying to build businesses, but they struggle so much But someone from outside can come here and run a very successful business and not even hire the local people. We don't implement our own projects. We don't allow for them to be implemented because we don't allow the time. And we don't consult properly. That's another thing. We shortcut every system that we have.
All right. I do need to move on. Thank you. Thanks for your points. We'll address them. There was one more hand. I think it was at the back there. Yeah.
Thanks for creating a segue there for me. I think having listened to the conversation, what I appreciated was the honesty that a realistic alternative doesn't exist today, because this is something that is deep in business that we're talking about. And I've had a lot of things being mentioned. I've had mobilization of citizens. I've had policy. I've had capable state. But we've concluded, and it's a working group with about 100 companies, that we are talking about an issue of will. And for me, that is something that I haven't had in the conversation. Where is the hard transformation in the conversation? And I know when you reference all leaders, people that some of us have to draw inspiration from, you see as a moderate. But those basic principles are what we need right now to activate and say, why do you have to see that ground? Why do you have to even infuse in you, the rationale? The rationale is so obvious. And my concern is that the poor people of this country are impatient and are getting urgent by day. What we see are indicators, and there's going to get to a point where they've got nothing to lose. And that's really the reason why I have a question for Caesar to say, can we actually afford a socialist utopia? Because if everything falls, actually what then happens to the marginalized? Some people will have passports and will have exit strategies, but the marginalized of this country will remain poor.
Thank you. By the way, I don't have an exit strategy. So I'm interested in the answer to that question. Caesar, I'll start with you and we'll go this way.
Sure. No, and I wasn't advocating for socialist dystopia, but the point I was trying to make is that I think a more experimental approach may actually lead to different outcomes. And I feel like what we've been doing right now is doing the same things over and over again while tinkering at the margins without having the ambition to try new things, particularly on the left. And so if that doesn't work, then I think people on the left would have to have the honesty to say, you know what, we gave it our all, we tried it, and these are the results. And it actually turned out worse. We became even more unequal than the most unequal country in the world right now. My gut is that that wouldn't happen. My gut is that if we were a bit more ambitious about land, if we were a bit more ambitious about how the state could play a role in the economy from the start, we'd be in a better position now. But I don't think we should use the fear of the unknown to prevent us from taking steps towards the unknown. It's going to require a bit of imagination, but I mean, we know what's going to happen if we keep doing the same things. And as you say, how much longer can we defy gravity for? Because either we do something ambitious or something ambitious happens to us anyway, exactly as you've said. And so the alternative is do nothing and wait for the time bomb to go off, which results in a dystopia anyway, or try something different and use the results, use the feedback we get to amend it in that way. And ultimately, you know, sticking with ticking time bombs, the ecological time bomb that was mentioned earlier is a welcome introduction into the debate, because again, it's this insistence that if we don't do something, something's going to happen to us. And it seems to me that if we continue with the same model of capitalism practiced in various places, that doesn't actually matter to the profit motive. I think it would go on until we reach the precipice. And so again, if we don't do something, something happens to us. And what's so hard about trying something different? Let's be scientific as opposed to being ideological. let's try something, get the results back, and work from that basis. I think that's the most appropriate course to follow.
In a society as unequal as ours, for any moment that anybody is comfortable, it is coming at the expense of someone else. And that is something we should constantly bear in mind, right? Because sometimes, you know, while there are the big systemic stuff going on, in many ways, they are a reflection of us, who we are as a society. One example of this, in the city of Johannesburg, the city started cleaning up street vendors who were selling. These are people who, you know, have put kids through school, feed their families. The operation was called Operation Clean Sweep. Just imagine talking about people as if they are dirt that needs to be swept off. Now, what was very fascinating about that, it got a lot of support, right? Companies, people were like, oh, now it's clear in front of my business. The pavement is clear, you know? And some of the city, like the city was like, I'm responding to the ratepayer. So who is seen as human is also linked to who gives something. It's not about you just existing as a human being. Now, the reason I say this is just to point out that there are some systemic stuff, some very, very big things that we have to deal with. But again, I come back to these things did not just happen. We have to interrogate very, very deeply. What does it mean? How did we come to be like this? Who benefits? Who doesn't? Is there a price to pay for it? And I think part of the discussion, there was a bit, elections came up, right? And people being tied to the ANC. If we look over the years, people have actually stopped voting because there's no alternative. The ANC's votes have been decreasing over time. So the idea that people are still doing the same thing is also false. But on the other hand, to understand the elections or to give elections that amount of power worries me, right? Because in South Africa, when we discuss power or think about it or imagine it, it assumes that power is monolithic, right? So just monolithic power would be, there's a person on top, you remove them, things will change. In the same way, there's this idea, you change the party, things will change. Unfortunately, the systems are actually, in some instances, much deeper than just about the party, right? If you aren't changing the influence of private capital, it doesn't matter who the party is if the influence they hold is still there. Another example is, we've seen some of the changes in some municipalities, right? But for a lot of poor Black people in those spaces, has there been a material change over the years? So I think we should just be a bit careful about how we assert power. I'm interested in how do we flip the triangle of monolithic power at the top, right? How do we say this is a society of people? Our laws, our social norms, right down to even this economic system that is often talked about as if it's very divorced from people and should exist on its own as some nice growing thing, you know? How are all of these in service of a dignified, decent life for all, you know? And I think that requires a lot of imagination. It requires thinking about how do we rebuild our society in very fundamental ways. And I completely agree with you about, you know, there is this tendency, you know, of, you know, everything must just go and we'll build it from scratch. Unfortunately, the reality is it's often driven by people who will be the most protected, right? Who will not be at the forefront when the harm is done. I mean, one of the things I often talk about is how, like, you know, being a whistleblower, you know, people are encouraged to blow the whistle. It's very romanticized. It is often forgotten that there are real costs that people pay, lives are lost, And when you are in that situation, very often you are on your own, right? We're not creating these communities of support that enable such environments, you know? So I think that's almost the challenge. So part of me, back in my days, I used to always think that the challenge of our time is how do we exist in a system but not be off that system, right? But now I think I've come to ask myself, like, who defines that system? Who says, why am I talking about that system as if it's cast in stone and can't be changed? And this isn't about going back to dogma and, you know, it's just about with what we have, how are we building the building blocks to build what it is we want? And at the heart of it, it's people. It's in the service of people. It's in the service of the environment. Because as Dale mentioned, I mean, we have only one world, right? And yeah, if the earth goes, what are we going to do?
Thank you. I want to start where Koketo ended. On the 3-4 years ago, we launched the Mandela Initiative, whose report will be released in the next few weeks. I'm looking at Sumaya for an answer. So in the next few weeks, we'll launch this report. And what we're doing there was precisely to begin to ask the question, what do we need to do differently for us to arrive at these conclusions that we have? And few universities participated in that initiative, and that report then gave a couple projects that we need to then embark on, and we've decided on one, being early childhood development, which is headed by Sumaya. And this project is ensuring that we get the foundation right. Because you'll remember the Fees Must Fall movement convinced us that there's no future until you pay for universities. And actually, that's not true. The future starts there. For as long as we destroy the foundation, we are going nowhere. So Sumaya and team are now looking at this, how do we get ECD right so that we can then get the fundamentals right for our education system to be fixed. The first 1,000 days of a child, make sure that they have a good start, and do all the fundamentals that need to be done for us to get somewhere. The second thing that we've decided on is to go back to your input about communities not having access to information, and we have decided to reconvene community dialogues, go back to basics of going to communities to understand what needs to be done differently. And in fact, I think again, Sumaya and team have been going to the land debates, where we're going to communities, the grassroots organizations. A couple of months ago, we hosted a dialogue with some of those organizations, grassroots organizations that are looking at land. And we're looking at the intersectionality between all these problems, where you look at ECDs, why are ECDs not being registered? And why do they remain informal forever? And one of the conclusions was title deeds. You know, when you don't have a title to the land, the state doesn't subsidize you. You look at how much it subsidizes you per child for. So all those policy decisions that were taken in the past that need to be relooked into. And the final point that I want to make is, again, it goes back to us rethinking what's there, what needs to be changed, without necessarily saying it must fall. Because I think there's a place for things to fall. But we've learned that once they fall, some of the people who say fall, they're out of the system, and those for whom it falls forever. Their futures are doomed. So I think with fallism, we need to then be always saying, what's the alternative? And until such time that you have something that's really credible and tangible, that you're saying to me, this is what I'm giving you as the alternative, I'm very skeptical to then follow that route.
With regards to the point around the ecological limits of capitalism, and I think we are all aware of these, but I don't know of very many systems or countries that have adopted alternatives. But I think this understanding or looking at capitalism as a framework within which you can decide or make choices about how you would apply is the space that South Africa can be playing in right now. So there was mention earlier about the Scandinavian countries, and that's part of the capitalist system, but they've just taken different choices. So for instance, we have, something that I've mentioned a few times today, mineral resources. Why have we not created a sovereign fund that we can invest in different ways from our minerals? And then with regards to the point around when will businesses do or support out of will, I think we're not going to get to that point. If we think about these are, the very rationale about businesses is profit maximization, right? So I think what we need to be thinking about, how do we set the rules of the game to ensure that business and other participants, in the economy or the country as a whole are playing by those very rules. And this is about understanding that the rules that we have are a choice. So yes, globalization came, and it came with all these opportunities and some limitations to the way that you can develop as an economy. So we couldn't, for instance, copy and paste the Asian model or the model that was taken by the Asian tigers, because the international rules changed. But what was very strange about South Africa is we were extreme. Even when there were opportunities within those rules to be quite decisive and very clear that we were supporting a broader-based economy, we didn't take those decisions. Trade liberalization is an example. Early 90s, we were like, we are opening up everything, right? And there was great evidence at that point in time that you need to support the development of new industries. And research time and time and again has shown that the companies or the industries and sectors that benefited from that were those that were already at the technology frontier, right? Those that were already competitive. So these black businesses and small businesses that we said we were trying to support, they were already on the back foot. And that was a choice. There's a clear link between the choices that we make and the outcomes that we get. And I think this is what we try what I was trying to bring home around how power influences the choices that we make and how we can get to a situation where different choices are being made. Because this is going to be very important. And information, which was the point that was raised, I think, from that side, is a very important aspect of this. And I think economists, which is my profession, are a bit to blame for a lot of this. We try to make a lot of these things very complicated. Economics is very scientific, and the layman won't be able to understand it. And this is completely not true. Economics is a social science. And also how some of these narratives are driven. So for instance, now when there was the announcement that the Competition Act was going to be amended, there were probably 10 articles I saw within a few days that talked about how this is going to be overreach, this is going to chill investments, and there were maybe 1 or 2 articles that were talking about, but what does this really mean, and what potential impact could we have in setting the rules differently? And that's about narrative. And there's power in narrative, right? It's a source of power. And there's a role to play for research centers like the one that I work for, where we are trying to bring about evidence of the alternatives and how they can actually work. Because then when there are movements or groups that are organizing, there's evidence that can be used to back up to say, no, actually, you don't have to be dealing with inflation by raising interest rates. There are many ways to do this. But you try to engage people, even decision makers on this, and the first thing they say is, you simply don't understand. And you can break all these things down into a way that people understand. And this is how we can get communities to participate, right? Because if we're saying, well, what do you understand about macroeconomic policy? Then a person may be like, macro what? And they feel at the back foot. But these things are people that understand, because if you raise interest rate, you're raising interest rate for that person in the community. And actually, the biggest problem with inflation in our country is about credit. And there are many different ways that you can curb credit, not just by raising interest rates, right? So it's about looking at the problems that we have and practically, and I mean, I hope that one day we do think of or come up with different systems, but I would say for now, let's make different and better choices and maybe think about capitalism more as a framework rather than saying we need to adopt the most standard version of it. And understanding incentives is a key part of this, because just because all policies are not aligned with what businesses want doesn't mean that they won't invest. And there are a lot of interesting examples where policies that supposedly were against a business have led to investment. I could make examples, but it seems Sicky's in a bit of a rush.
But thank you very much. I think let's give them a round of applause, please. I hope that we have sparked a little bit of debate. I think all of these things are things we're going to be grappling with for a very long time. But I think if we do it together or in our little pockets and start to share, we might possibly find a different framework within the building blocks that we sit with. But thanks for your attention. Refreshments, see, told you English runs away. Refreshments will be served downstairs, and please do join us. Thank you very much.
Clientele funeral plans.
It's your final gift of love.
I chose a clientele funeral plan because it's affordable and suits my budget.
I chose clientele because they are an original. They've been around for a long time, and I know with them my family are in good hands.
I'm a farmer, and I'm a businessman, and I know a good deal when I see one. Clientele is a good deal.
Clientele is the name I trust.
SMS plan to 31043 and we'll call you back.
News at 9. We go beyond the headlines of the day and breaking news to bring you all the angles and in-depth analysis of stories that impact your life. We are on the ball with all economic stories. Our bureaus around the globe are ready to connect you to events as and when they happen. So join us every day at 9 to zoom in on the day's big stories.
SABC News. We've been bringing you live coverage of the dialogue following the earlier lecture, Nelson Mandela Lecture by former US President Barack Obama. That's come to an end, so we can continue with normal programming.
Absolutely. And I see some of you have been tweeting about inclusive capitalism, so we do appreciate that. And as always, we invite you to send us your views on any of the features that we bring you here on The Full View, and you can send those to sabcnews.com, or you'll also find us on Facebook or Twitter.
So coming up, we'll look at the beetle that has been destroying trees in Johannesburg, other provinces as well. The latest headlines warning of a possible tree apocalypse if this is not dealt with seriously. And of course, we'll also be hearing from the Secretary General.
Absolutely. Ace Magashule, and interview with him this afternoon. So we'll have to hear what he has to say on the back of that Sunday Times article, expose of sorts about a plot, an alleged plot to oust President Cyril Ramaphosa.
These are tonight's top stories.
Most Well, serious violent crimes are on the rise. The annual crime statistics were presented by the Ministry of Police in Parliament today, and murder, attempted murder and sexual offences have all increased.
Well, politicians across party lines have expressed dissatisfaction with the nearly 7% increase in murders in South Africa. This means that every day 57 people are being killed across the country.
South Africans have the right to live free of fear of being harmed. That's the position of Police Minister Bheki Cele. He says the crime statistics for the period April 2017 to March 2018 are simply unacceptable.
The Ministry of Police and the South African Police Service should put their heads on the block, in that this situation must be arrested with swiftness it deserves, and it must be reversed with a lightning speed. The worst thing we can do, which cannot be done during my tenure in this office, is to come and give the same crime statistics again next year, or worse than what we have currently done.
More than 20,000 murders have been recorded. Murders against women and children have also risen.
Women